Most people who recognize the name Anne Boleyn know almost nothing about the woman who raised her. Elizabeth Howard appears in nearly every account of the Tudor court, usually in a single sentence: wife of Thomas Boleyn, mother of a queen. She is connected to one of the most studied families in English history, and yet she leaves behind almost no record of her own voice. No letter written in her hand survives. No diary, no private account of what she thought or felt during the years that built and then destroyed her family. Who was the woman behind that one sentence, and what does her near-total absence from the record actually tell us about her life? Elizabeth Howard is born around 1480, though a few historians place her birth several years earlier into one of the most prominent noble families in England. Her father is Thomas Howard, who will later become the second Duke of Norfolk. Her mother is Elizabeth Tilney. She grows up alongside several siblings, including her older brother Thomas, who will later become the third Duke of Norfolk in his own right. On paper, this is a birth into privilege. In practice, it is a birth into a family crisis. In 1483, Elizabeth's grandfather, John Howard, had been created Duke of Norfolk by King Richard III. In August 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth, John Howard is killed fighting for Richard against the invading Henry Tudor. Elizabeth's father, Thomas, fights beside him, is badly wounded, and is taken prisoner. Richard III is dead. Henry Tudor becomes Henry VII. The Howard family, loyal to the losing king, loses its dukedom. Thomas Howard is attainted and sent to the Tower of London, where he remains for roughly 3.5 years. Elizabeth is about 5 years old when this happens. This is the environment Elizabeth Howard grows up in. Not a family enjoying settled power, but one working patiently to earn its way back into royal favor. Her father is released from the Tower in 1489 and is restored only to his earlier title, Earl of Surrey. He spends the following decades in royal service, sent to keep order in the north of England, made a member of the King's Council, appointed Lord Treasurer in 1501. In September 1513, while Henry VIII is in France, Thomas Howard leads the English army that defeats and kills the Scottish king, James IV, at the Battle of Flodden. Only after that victory, in 1514, is the Dukedom of Norfolk restored to him. By then, Elizabeth is a married woman with children of her own, watching her father complete a recovery that began when she was a small child. He lives another decade, dying at his castle in Framlingham in 1524, at nearly 80 years old, having spent most of his adult life rebuilding what the defeat at Bosworth had taken from the family. It is at the royal court, sometime around 1499, that Elizabeth marries Thomas Boleyn. He is not from a titled family. His father, Sir William Boleyn, is a wealthy landowner whose own family had built its fortune in trade a few generations earlier before moving into the gentry. Under ordinary circumstances, a bride of Elizabeth's rank, the granddaughter of a duke, might have expected a grander match. But circumstances are not ordinary. With the Howards still working to recover from the consequences of Bosworth, a talented and ambitious courtier of lower birth like Thomas Boleyn is not considered beneath her. As the Howard family's position improves over the following decades, Thomas Boleyn's own status improves with it. What actually passes between Elizabeth and Thomas as husband and wife is difficult to know. Unlike many political marriages of the period, this one left behind no personal letters and no account by a friend or relative describing the household. What survives instead is a detailed record of Thomas Boleyn's career. He proves himself a skilled linguist and negotiator. The scholar Erasmus, who dedicates 2 of his own books to Thomas, considers him an outstandingly learned man. In 1512 and 1513, Thomas serves as an envoy to the court of Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands, where his speed as a negotiator reportedly wins him a personal wager with Margaret over how quickly a treaty could be concluded, earning him a Spanish horse as his prize. He later serves as English ambassador to France and, still later, as envoy to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Alongside these diplomatic postings, he holds a series of senior offices at home, including Constable of Dover Castle and Treasurer of the King's Household from 1522, and by the early 1520s he holds more than 20 manors, making him one of the wealthiest men at court. Thomas Boleyn's advancement is therefore well underway years before either of his daughters attracts the king's romantic attention, a fact that complicates the later popular image, familiar from novels and television dramas, of a father who pushed his children toward the throne purely for his own benefit. While Thomas travels on royal business, Elizabeth manages a household and raises children. She serves at court herself, first as a lady-in-waiting to Elizabeth of York, Henry VII's queen, and later to Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. She takes personal charge of her children's early education, teaching them music, dance, embroidery, poetry, good manners, household management, arithmetic, grammar, history, reading, writing, and some French. Of the three children, Anne in particular is thought by historians to have remained especially close to her mother into adulthood, more so than her sister Mary. According to Thomas Boleyn's own later account, Elizabeth is pregnant many times, but only 3 of their children survive into adulthood: Mary, Anne, and George. Historians still disagree on the exact number of pregnancies and on the precise birth order of the 2 daughters, though most now place Mary as the elder, born around 1499 or 1500, with Anne born around 1501, and George arriving a few years after that, around 1504. Even Anne's birth year remains genuinely disputed among historians, with some arguing for a date as late as 1507. By the early 1520s, the family Elizabeth has built is advancing quickly. Thomas secures a place for the young Anne at the court of Margaret of Austria in 1513, an arrangement regarded as an excellent education for a girl of her rank, and both Mary and Anne later serve as ladies-in-waiting to Queen Claude of France. Thomas is involved in preparing the 1520 meeting between Henry VIII and the French king, Francis I, the diplomatic summit remembered as the Field of Cloth of Gold. Mary, the elder daughter, returns to the English court and becomes, for a period in the early to mid-1520s, one of Henry VIII's mistresses, a role that carries no formal status and produces no acknowledged children, but places the Boleyn family firmly within the king's personal circle. Some contemporaries also alleged an earlier liaison with the French king, Francis I, during Mary's years at the French court, though the evidence behind that particular rumor is thin and rests largely on later, hostile gossip. Then, around 1525 or 1526, Henry's attention shifts to Anne. Unlike her sister, Anne does not become the king's mistress. It is at this point that Elizabeth begins to appear in the record as an active participant, not just an unnamed presence. Several sources describe her as Anne's protective chaperone, accompanying her daughter to court specifically to help her avoid a sexual relationship with the king, while Anne holds out for marriage instead. When Cardinal Wolsey, the family's most powerful political opponent, falls from royal favor in 1529, it is Elizabeth who travels with Anne to view Wolsey's former residence, York Place, shortly after it passes into the king's hands. That documented visit shows something important. Elizabeth is not a distant observer of her daughter's rise. She is present for it, involved in it, standing beside Anne as the family's position is transformed. These changes happen quickly. In June 1525, Thomas Boleyn is made Viscount Rochford, and Elizabeth becomes Viscountess Rochford. In 1527, he gains recognition as Earl of Ormond, a title connected to his grandmother's Irish family, and in 1529, he is created Earl of Wiltshire. Elizabeth becomes Countess of Wiltshire and Countess of Ormond, the highest titles she will ever hold. Henry VIII marries Anne in a secret ceremony in January 1533. On the 1st of June that year, 6 months pregnant, Anne is crowned queen at Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth remains within her daughter's household throughout Anne's time as queen consort. On the 7th of September, 1533, Anne gives birth to a daughter. The child is named Elizabeth, a name honoring both the king's late mother, Elizabeth of York, and the baby's own grandmother, Elizabeth Boleyn. That baby grows up to become Queen Elizabeth I. Anne's rise to the throne also produces one of the most damaging and persistent rumors ever attached to Elizabeth Howard, one that says more about Tudor politics than about anything Elizabeth actually did. As Henry VIII pursued the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, gossip began circulating at court, claiming that he had, years earlier, had an affair with Elizabeth herself. Several contemporaries repeated versions of this claim. One court figure alleged that the king had kept both the mother and the daughter. A Yorkshire priest claimed Henry had dealt with the mother and afterward with the daughter. When the courtier George Throckmorton raised the subject directly with the king, asking about his relations with Anne's mother, Henry is recorded as replying, in effect, never with the mother, an answer that, whether or not it was entirely truthful, at least confirms he did not deny an affair with Mary. Decades later, writing in exile during the reign of Anne's daughter, Elizabeth I, the Catholic priest Nicholas Sander took the claim a step further. Sander wrote that Anne herself was not Thomas Boleyn's daughter at all, but Henry's, conceived during one of Thomas's long diplomatic postings abroad. Sander had never met any of the people he described. He was writing decades after the events, from exile, with the openly stated goal of undermining the legitimacy of the Protestant queen, Elizabeth I, by attacking her mother's birth. Modern historians treat Sander's account as religious propaganda rather than a credible record. The timeline he proposed does not match the documented dates of Thomas Boleyn's travels, and Henry VIII, a king already anxious about the legal standing of his own marriages, is an unlikely candidate to have knowingly courted and married a woman who might have been his own daughter. The rumor persisted for centuries anyway, less because of any evidence behind it than because it offered a convenient way to damage the reputation of a family that had become politically inconvenient to those in power after Anne's death. While Anne's story dominates the historical record, her siblings' lives unfold alongside hers, each eventually drawn into the same family crisis. Mary, the elder daughter, marries first in 1520 to a courtier named William Carey, who dies of sweating sickness in 1528. 6 years later, in 1534, Mary secretly marries again, this time to William Stafford, a soldier more than a decade younger than her, with modest means and few prospects to offer. She is pregnant at the time. When the marriage becomes known, the reaction from her own family is severe. Queen Anne, now at the height of her power, is furious that her sister married without permission and to a man considered far beneath the family's new rank. Thomas Boleyn cuts off Mary's financial support. Mary and her husband are banished from court and left, for a period, in real financial difficulty, forced to write to the king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, asking for help. Mary largely disappears from court life after this point. She will not see her sister Anne again before Anne's death. George Boleyn, the youngest child and the only son to survive infancy, follows a different path. Born around 1504, he is educated at St. Paul's School in London and at Cambridge, and grows into a skilled courtier, diplomat, and poet, known at court for his sympathy toward the new religious ideas associated with the Protestant Reformation. In 1524, he marries Jane Parker, the daughter of a baron, and by the early 1530s, he has become one of his sister Anne's closest allies at court, entrusted with sensitive diplomatic missions to France as the king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon is being dismantled. His career advances alongside his sister's, and in 1536, he is destroyed alongside her as well. In the spring of 1536, the family's position collapses with extraordinary speed. Anne and George are both arrested on the 2nd of May, accused of adultery and, in George's case, of incest with his own sister. Historians today regard these charges as almost certainly fabricated, the product of a political effort to remove a queen who had failed to produce a male heir and who had accumulated powerful enemies at court. 4 courtiers accused alongside Anne are tried and convicted on the 12th of May. Anne and George, as members of the nobility, are tried separately 3 days later, on the 15th, each before a jury of peers. The court is presided over by the Lord High Steward, Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, Elizabeth's own brother, and Anne and George's uncle, who reads the sentence aloud himself. Both are found guilty. George is executed on Tower Hill on the 17th of May, 1536, alongside the 4 other men convicted with him. Before he dies, he addresses the crowd briefly, telling them that he accepts the judgment of the law against him. Anne is executed 2 days later, on the 19th of May, beheaded by a swordsman brought specially from France. Within 1 week in May 1536, Elizabeth Howard loses both her surviving daughter and her only surviving son. One popular myth about the case is worth correcting here. For centuries, retellings blamed George's own wife, Jane Parker, for supplying the testimony that doomed him, painting her as a jealous woman who chose to help destroy her husband. More recent research points instead to Elizabeth Somerset, Countess of Worcester, as the Queen's principal accuser, and finds no solid evidence that Jane testified against George at all. It is a reminder of how easily invented detail attaches itself to the women connected to this family, and how carefully each claim needs to be checked against the surviving record. What did Elizabeth do during those weeks? The honest answer is that nobody knows. There is no surviving letter from her describing her state of mind. There is no record of her visiting the Tower of London to see her children before their deaths, no petition for mercy written in her name, no account from anyone at court describing her grief or her reaction. This silence stands in sharp contrast to the well-documented record of her presence during her daughter's rise only a few years earlier. Historians have offered several possible explanations. Court records from around this time describe Elizabeth as seriously unwell. One document from 1536 notes, in its own words, that she was sore diseased with the cough. It is possible illness kept her away from events she otherwise would have attended. It is also possible that, as a woman with no formal political power of her own, there was simply nothing she could do to influence a case being driven entirely by the king and his ministers. Whatever the explanation, the absence of any personal record from Elizabeth during the worst weeks of her life remains one of the most striking gaps in the entire Tudor archive. Elizabeth does not recover from this period. Her husband, Thomas, survives the deaths of his son and daughter, keeps his earldom, and even attends the christening of Prince Edward, the son born to Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, in October 1537. A sign that he manages, at least outwardly, to remain in the king's favor. Elizabeth's own health continues to decline. She dies on the 3rd of April, 1538, near Baynard's Castle in London, roughly 2 years after watching the state execute 2 of her 3 surviving children. A court official named Thomas Worley records her death in a letter to a contact in Calais, noting that she had died a few days earlier, close to Baynard's Castle. She is buried 4 days later at St. Mary's Church in Lambeth, her funeral procession carried by barge along the Thames and lit by torches, the boat draped in black cloth marked with a white cross. She rests in the Howard family chapel there, among other women of her birth family, rather than beside her husband. Thomas Boleyn dies 11 months later, in March 1539, and is buried instead at Hever, the Boleyn family seat in Kent. Whether this separation reflects a personal estrangement between husband and wife, or simply an established pattern of Howard women being returned to their own family's burial ground, is a question historians continue to debate, since so little evidence survives either way. After Thomas's death, the earldoms of Wiltshire and Ormond, which require a male heir, cannot pass down the direct Boleyn line, since George died without a surviving legitimate child. The titles Elizabeth spent decades helping to build effectively end with her husband. Mary, the daughter who had been cut off and disowned for marrying beneath her station, becomes, in the end, the last member of the immediate Boleyn family left alive. She outlives her parents, her sister, and her brother, dying in 1543. Elizabeth's legacy continues instead through her granddaughter. Princess Elizabeth, stripped of her title after Anne's execution and declared illegitimate, eventually becomes Queen Elizabeth I in 1558, ruling England for 45 years. Through her, Elizabeth Howard becomes the grandmother of one of the most consequential monarchs in English history, though she dies 20 years before her granddaughter takes the throne and never sees her reign. There is one more connection worth noting. Elizabeth's brother, Edmund Howard, has a daughter named Catherine. Years after Anne's execution, Catherine Howard becomes Henry VIII's fifth wife, making her and Anne Boleyn first cousins through Elizabeth's own birth family. Twice within a single generation of the same extended family, a Howard woman becomes Queen of England, and both marriages end in execution. Elizabeth does not live to see her niece's rise or death, but the pattern running through her own family, in which women become central to major political events while holding almost no power over the outcome, repeats itself within a few years of her death. For centuries after her death, Elizabeth Howard remains almost entirely absent from popular retellings of the Boleyn story. Novels, films, and television dramas focus on her husband's supposed ambition, her daughter's rivalry, and her son's downfall, while Elizabeth herself receives only minor attention, present in scenes but rarely given words of her own. Only in recent years have historians begun trying to recover her as a subject in her own right, rather than as a footnote attached to more famous names. A full biography devoted entirely to her life, piecing together scattered court records, household accounts, and the occasional mention in someone else's letter, is only now being published, nearly 500 years after her death, to reconstruct a life that was, by any measure, remarkable. A woman born into a disgraced noble family, who married into a rising one, who personally educated a future queen, who stood beside her daughter at the moment of her greatest political triumph, and who then watched, in near total silence, as that same daughter and her only son were taken from her within the space of 2 days. Elizabeth Howard spent her entire adult life at the center of the English court, present for nearly every major event in one of history's most famous families, and she still managed to leave almost nothing behind to tell us, in her own words, what any of it felt like.